The Buddha taught that all phenomenon, including thoughts, emotions, and experiences, are marked by these three characteristics, or the three universal truths. Impermanence, which is anicca in the language of the Buddhist time of Pali. Suffering or dissatisfaction, that's dukkha, and not self, anatta or anatta. It has several ways of pronunciation, they all do. So these apply to all conditioned things. That's everything except nibbana. And according to the Buddha, fully understanding and appreciating the three universal truths is essential to realizing enlightenment. It's an understanding that's accepted in both Theravadan and Mahayana schools, but it's more emphasized in Theravadan. Everything changes, the Buddha taught. And this may seem obvious, but much of the time we relate to things as if their existence were permanent. So when we lose things that we think we can't live without, or receive bad news, we think will ruin our lives, we experience a great deal of stress. Nothing is impermanent. Nothing is permanent, including our lives. So to briefly mention these three, you'll hear me mention them a few more times so we can remember them by the end of the talk. Dukkha, suffering or dissatisfaction, is amongst the most misunderstood ideas in Buddhism. Life is dukkha, the Buddha said, but he didn't mean that it is all unhappiness and disappointment. Rather, he meant that ultimately it cannot satisfy. Even when things do satisfy, a pleasant time with friends, a wonderful meal, a new car, a place to live, a different job, the satisfaction doesn't last because all things are impermanent. Anatta, not self, or non-essentiality, egolessness, is even more difficult to grasp. The Buddha taught that there is no unchanging, permanently existing self that inhabits our bodies. In other words, we do not have a fixed absolute identity. The experience of I, continuing through life as a separate, singular being, is an illusion. What we call the self is a construct of physical, mental, and sensory processes that are independent and constantly in flux. It's the illusion of a separate, permanent self that chains us to suffering and dissatisfaction. The Buddha said we put most of our energy into protecting the self, trying to gratify it and clinging to impermanent things we think will enhance it. But belief in a separate, permanent self leads to the craving that, according to the Four Noble Truths, is the source of our suffering. The Buddha's teachings, especially the practice of the Eightfold Path, provide the medicine to cure our illusions so that we become less self-centered and less attached to impermanent things. And as we investigate the truth of the three universal truths, or the marks of existence is another thing that they're called, we develop factors of enlightenment, such as equanimity, the ability not to be jerked around by our likes and dislikes, and even serenity. A couple of weeks ago when I taught last, I mentioned that I'd continue the conversation about ourselves and looking at personal experience in terms of body and mind. So this subject on the three universal characteristics of existence, also called the three universal truths, is an important part of the teachings of the Buddha. Like the Four Noble Truths, karma, the teaching of dependent origination, and the five aggregates, the teaching of the three universal truths is part of what we might call the doctrinal contents of wisdom. It's a wisdom teaching. In other words, when we talk about the knowledge and understanding that is implied by wisdom, we have this teaching in mind. But before we examine the characteristics individually, let's come to an understanding of what they mean and in what way they're actually useful. First of all, what is a characteristic and what is it not? A characteristic is something which is necessarily connected with something else. Because the characteristic is necessarily connected with something, it can tell us about the nature of that thing. So let's take the example of heat, for instance. Heat is a characteristic of fire, but not a characteristic of water. Heat is the characteristic of fire because the heat of the fire is always and invariably connected with the fire. On the other hand, the heat of water depends on external factors. A fire source, an electric stove, the heat of the sun, and so on. But the heat of fire is natural to fire. It is in this way that the Buddha uses the term characteristic to refer to facts about the nature of existence that are always connected with existence and that are always found in existence. The characteristic heat is always connected with fire. So we can understand something about the nature of fire from heat. We can understand that fire is hot. We can understand that we can use fire to cook our food, to warm ourselves, and so on. The characteristic of heat tells us something about fire, how to use the fire, what to do with the fire. If we were to think of the characteristic of heat as connected with water, it wouldn't help us use the water because heat is not always connected with water. We can't cook our food with water. We can't warm ourselves with water. So when the Buddha said that there are 3 characteristics of existence, he meant that these characteristics are always present in existence and that they help us to understand what to do with existence. The 3 universal truths that we have in mind are the characteristics of impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and not self, anatta. And these 3 characteristics are always present in or are connected with existence. And they tell us about the nature of existence. They help us to know what to do with existence. What we learn to develop as a result of understanding the 3 characteristics is renunciation. Once we understand that existence is universally characterized by impermanence, suffering, and not self, we eliminate our attachment to existence. And once we eliminate our attachment to existence, we gain the threshold of freedom, of nibbana. And this is the purpose that understanding the 3 universal truths serves. It removes attachment by removing delusions. The misunderstanding that existence is permanent, is pleasant, and has something to do with the self. And this is why understanding the 3 universal truths is part of the contents of wisdom. So I'm going to go over it again. Impermanence, anicca. This truth is the foundation of Buddhism. We can see it as soon as we close our eyes and pay attention to the breath. It arises and passes due to its own conditions coming together. We can't make it stay. It goes on its own accord. And the Buddha said that all compounded phenomenon disintegrate. All things are made of parts. All things fall apart. Things are impermanent because they're compounded. Anything that is assembled will sooner or later come apart. Another blunter way to put it is that everything dies. When we realize this truth deep down and are not intellectually, it's not just what we call liberation, release from this one-pointed, narrow-minded belief in permanence. And then we have suffering, dukkha. Every experience is marked by some quality of suffering, whether it's extreme pain, a background sense of unease, even love and affection, kindness and devotion, those pleasant and lovely emotions. We don't think of them as painful, but nevertheless, they change. And this means that in the end, they are a source of pain. Emotions are painful. It is because they are impermanent that they are uncertain and always accompanied by hopes and fears. But ultimately, they don't have and never have had an inherently existent nature. As long as we struggle to maintain a solid sense of self, our lives will be marked by stress and fear. This is why we do samatha, or concentration practices, and vipassana, or insight meditation. It helps to loosen the grip that our emotions have on us and the obsessions that we have because of them. And then we have non-self, anatta. There is no solid, separate, single self. We have no core. We're simply the product of multiple causes and conditions. The 5 aggregates is a good way to understand this, and I'll mention it again later. Impermanence describes things, how things are. Non-self describes what they are not. I'll say that again. Impermanence describes how things are. Non-self describes what they are not. Thich Nhat Hanh says, impermanence is emptiness in terms of time. Non-self is emptiness in terms of space. With emptiness, the Buddha meant that things do not truly exist as we mistakenly believe they do, and that they are really empty of that falsely ascribed existence. Sherry Huber is a Zen student and an author of like 24 books. And she has a weekly call-in radio show. And she says, if you want to be free, you must find the courage and willingness to be still and face the fear that arises when you attempt to come back to yourself. Some years ago, someone told me of a friend who went to India to study meditation. And he approached a very renowned and learned Buddhist teacher and asked him for some meditation instructions. The teacher was reluctant to teach him because he wasn't convinced of his sincerity. And the person persisted and asked him again, and then asked him again. And finally, the teacher said to him, "You will die. Meditate upon that." Meditation on death is extremely beneficial. We all need to remember the certainty of our death. From the moment of our birth, we move towards death. Remembering this and remembering that at the time of death, wealth, family, and fame will be of no use to us. We must turn the mind to the practice of the Dharma. We know that death is absolutely certain. There has never been a single living being who escaped death. Anicca, impermanence, means that nothing can be a permanent, everlasting entity. As everything arises, will cease. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which was the sutta that includes quite a bit of what the Buddha said on his deathbed, some of his last words. One of the interpretations of this sutta is impermanent are all component things. They arise and cease. That is their nature. They come into being and pass away. Release from them is bliss supreme. If we look at ourselves, we'll find that our bodies and feelings are impermanent. They are subject to constant changes. We will age, disease, and finally die. And similarly, our mental feelings are impermanent. We can't be in happy or sad states forever. Everything will pass. Everything around us, including natural phenomenon like the solar system, the ecosystem, are changing all the time. We can't predict earthquakes or droughts, hurricanes or typhoons. Not one thing will last forever. This process of constant changes goes on constantly, even without our noticing it. Our relationships are also subject to characteristic of impermanence and changes. Friends can become enemies. Enemies can become friends. Our possessions like clothes and wallets and furniture are impermanent. They wear and tear with time, and then we get new ones when the old ones get worn out. All of them will decay and eventually be destroyed. Understanding impermanence is important so that we don't lock ourselves into fixed, artificial, unchanging ideas of our relationship with others. Similarly, in one's career and normal life, we can't succeed if we don't keep abreast of changing situations and if we don't work hard to keep up with the changes. So whether it's in regard to our personal life or in regard to our public life, understanding impermanence is necessary. If we are to be effective and creative in the ways that we handle our personal and professional affairs. The understanding of impermanence, anicca, is an antidote to desire and ill will. It is a key to understanding the nature of things, to see the reality of things. When we understand anicca, when we understand impermanence, we also begin to see that things have no substantial existence of their own, non-self. So in this sense, impermanence is directly related to the third of the three characteristics, the characteristic of not self. And let's look at dukkha again, suffering, unsatisfactoriness. In the second fundamental characteristic of existence, and in the first noble truth of the list of the Four Noble Truths, is dukkha. It's been classified further into these three aspects. I've given whole Dharma talks on just the three aspects of dukkha. But one is intrinsic suffering, which is called dukkha. Number two is suffering in change because of change. That's viparinama dukkha. And then there's suffering that's due to existence, to formation. It's an existential kind of dukkha, sankhara dukkha. So physical and mental painful feelings are called intrinsic suffering. They arise because of changes in our body. We feel pain, we fall sick, and also changes to our feelings, our mental suffering. In this way, intrinsic suffering is called direct suffering. Physiological suffering, suffering because of birth, because of old age and disease and death, that's illustrated in the First Noble Truth, explain the physiological aspect of the issue. Psychological or mental suffering, association of what is not dear, separation from what is dear, not getting what one wants and getting what one does not want. It's also a cause of psychological suffering. The doctrinal aspect of suffering is stated in brief in the discourse referring to the clinging or grasping of the five aggregates. It is said that we are composed of the five aggregates. Grasping of material form, that's rupa. Grasping of feeling, that's vedana. Grasping of perception, that's called sanya. Grasping of mental formation, sankhara. And grasping of consciousness, vijnana. So the five aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. The Buddha once asked the Venerable Sariputta about the real nature of feelings. And Venerable Sariputta replied, "Threefold indeed are those feelings and sensations: pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant. But all these three feelings are impermanent and transient. When one realizes that whatever is transient must give rise to dukkha, no desire after them arises." The Buddha has said that whatever is impermanent is suffering, and whatever is impermanent and suffering is also not self. Whatever is impermanent is suffering because impermanence is an occasion for suffering. It's an occasion for suffering and not a cause of suffering. Because impermanence is only an occasion for suffering so long as ignorance, craving, and clinging are present. Because our ignorance of the reality of things, we crave and we cling to objects in the hopes that they might be permanent. And they may yield permanent happiness. And when we lose things that we long to be permanent, impermanence becomes an occasion for suffering. The way out of suffering, as per the fourth noble truth, is the eightfold path to absolute happiness, to freedom, to nibbana. The theory of anatta, of egolessness, is the third of the universal truths taught in early Buddhism. Atta in Pali means ego. Those who believe in an eternal being, an unchangeable ego, were called eternalists. And those who rejected the theory on the empirical grounds were called nihilists. And it was very popular during the Buddhist times of eternalists and nihilists. The rejection of the idea of I stands for the rejection of its substantial nature, permanence, and changeless reality. The Buddha rejected an external soul or being, hence anatta. This is not mine. This is not myself. This is not what I am. It's very helpful, I find, sometimes in my meditation practice when I'm really lost in a string of thoughts or something emotional that's happening, to really remind myself, not me, not mine, not about me. Not me, not mine, not about me. This is not what I am. In the second discourse that the Buddha gave, Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha mentioned that if the five aggregates, mainly the body, feeling, perception, mental processes, and consciousness, were self, then all of this will be permanent. But all of these are impermanent, anicca. Everything is beyond our control. And anatta, non-self. The Buddha has said that the self cannot be found in the body or the mind. The body is not the self. The self is not in the body. When we apply our meditation practice to see impermanence directly, we can't find any permanent sense of self in the body. If we search our body from the top of our head to the toes, we can't locate the self. Similarly, the mind is not the self and is subject to constant change. The mind is forever jumping about like a monkey. You've heard it referred to as monkey mind. It's elated at one time and depressed at another time. The self does not possess the mind because the mind becomes excited or depressed against our wishes, and we can't will our feelings. No solid self is in the mind. When we understand not self or anatta, we can give up this belief in an independent and permanent self and understand anicca. We can understand impermanence. Even more importantly, understanding not self is a key to enlightenment. The belief in a self is associated with ignorance, and ignorance is the most basic of the three defilements. When we have this conception of self, we respond to the persons and things around us, either with desire or with aversion. We like what's happening or we don't like what's happening. When we understand holding on to the self is the source and the cause of all suffering, and when we understand that the rejection of the self is the end of suffering, then we will let go of defending, protecting, and preserving the self. When we understand that all things are impermanent, anicca, are full of suffering, dukkha, and are not self, anatta, then our understanding of the truths is not merely intellectual or academic, but through study and consideration and meditation. The facts of impermanence, suffering, and not self become part of our immediate experience. Through the understanding of impermanence, suffering, and not self, we will have freed ourselves of the fundamental errors that imprison us within the cycle of birth and death, within samsara. We can then correct the error of seeing things as permanent, the error of seeing things as pleasant, and the error of seeing things as self. When these delusions are removed, wisdom arises. And when wisdom arises, one experiences the peace and freedom of nibbana. Let's take a few moments to let some of these words settle. I have another little section I want to share with you from a very poetic sutta. So let's just let those words on anicca, anatta, and dukkha settle. And we will reflect and talk about it a little more later. But just for now, as you come back to your breath or a touch point or any one of the other sense doors, notice with mindful awareness what is arising. When your attention falls upon something, do you notice maybe you're in the middle of it? And you notice the end when it falls away? Do you notice even a sensation in the body before it arises? Or the beginnings of a thought, the subtlety, the intention before it arises? So we just let ourselves stay open and notice the arising and passing away of what our mindfulness and awareness is attentive to. If something is pleasant, do we want to hang on to it? If something is unpleasant, is there a desire to get past it? We just open to what's happening right now. Maybe noticing its impermanent nature, noticing that it's something that you can't grasp onto or cling to or push away, impermanent, non-personal. Each of the sense doors brings experience. Hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. The thought door. And we have mindfulness arising with whatever comes into our awareness. Awareness stays with the object. When the object disappears on its own accord, our awareness of it disappears and it arises up again with the next object. Continuity of mindfulness, arising and passing away. Being present and interested. Holding ourselves in kindness without judgment. Being with what's happening now. I'd like to share a reference to a sutta translated by Andrew Olensky. He's a professor and director of the Mindfulness Studies program in Massachusetts. He's a scholar of early Buddhist thought and practice with a special interest in Buddhist psychology and its relevance to the modern world. Currently, he's a professor at Lesley University in Cambridge, and he's the director of its Mindfulness Studies program. And he heads up the first and I think the only program to offer master's degrees in the field of integrated mindfulness theory and practice. This particular sutta is called The Thorn in Your Heart. There's a copy by the door. You can pick it up and take it home with you if you want to. And it's in the Sutta Nipata. It's probably one of the most diverse collection of discourses to be found in the Pali Tipitaka. And a chapter from which this sutta is taken is the Atthaka Vagga. It might well be the oldest portion of the entire canon. And it's composed mostly in verse, and it includes some lovely poetry. The Thorn in Your Heart. This is from Sutta Nipata 935 to 939 and 948 to 951. Fear is born from arming oneself. Just see how many people fight. I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. Seeing creatures flopping around like fish in water, too shallow, so hostile to one another. Seeing this, I became afraid. This world completely lacks essence. It trembles in all directions. I longed to find myself a place unscathed, but I could not see it. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions. So if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down. Who here has crossed over desires, the world's bond, so hard to get past? He does not grieve. She does not mourn. His stream is cut. She's all unbound. What went before, let go of that. All that's to come, have none of it. Don't hold on to what's in between. And you'll wander fully at peace. For whom there is no eye-making, all throughout the body and mind, and who grieves not for what is not, is undefeated in the world. For whom there is no this is mine, nor anything like that is theirs, not even finding selfness, one does not grieve at I have nothing. There's something particularly moving about this. Maybe because it's composed in the first person and that it appears to reveal the process through which the Buddha himself came to understanding, perhaps because of the vulnerability expressed in the open stanzas where he admits his fear and sense of dread over the nature of human condition. Or maybe it's just the utter simplicity of first the problem, people hurting each other, and then its cause, basic human selfishness driven by desire. And then finally its solution, letting go of the ego's attachments. How easy he can make it all sound sometimes, so often. The first line alone is kind of counterintuitive. Conventional wisdom suggests that arming oneself is a prudent response to fear of self-injury. Yet the Buddha's wisdom goes deeper to observe how this actually contributes to generations of more fear. Do we really feel more safe when we lash out at our critics and our adversaries? Our culture certainly seems so, especially these days. But the Buddha is offering an alternative response, emerging from his own experience. The phrase translated here as arming oneself, which serves as the title of the sutta. It's also rendered embracing violence or violent conduct. The basic image is of a person taking up a stick, danda. and the stick being a common symbol in Indian literature for both violence and punishment. And Olendzki points out that the reader can hardly help feeling swept up in emotional turmoil of the author. And the tensions mount as the fear and despair builds and then breaks suddenly with the insight that, like an animal driven to madness by an injury, mankind is not evil by nature, but is only driven to violence by the relentless pressures of desire. The latter half of the poem describes how to cultivate a state of mind, a stance within unfolding experience that avoids the dysfunctional move of creating and projecting oneself onto every situation. These few verses really embrace the whole of the Four Noble Truths. Suffering manifests as violence. It's caused by the thorn in the heart, the unbinding or crossing over this, and the way to cultivate the selflessness that constitutes real freedom. So let's take some quiet time again to let the words settle down. And if anything I said was confusing or didn't make any sense, don't worry about it. Feel free to let go of anything that didn't work for you, and you can retain what might seem useful. To reflect on some of those thoughts about anicca, dukkha, and anatta. I'm going to pass out. Would you pass these around, Steve? I think they're worth keeping for you to take home and look at later as a reminder of some of the things that we talked about. And it also gives us just some questions to ponder. And maybe we can have a little conversation around anicca, dukkha, and anatta. I mean, some of the basic questions in the first paragraph there is, how does the concept of impermanence impact our daily lives and relationships? And what does dukkha mean beyond simple suffering? Or how can we cultivate more resilience under it, under so much suffering? And what are the implications of anatta for our sense of self and our interaction with others? And take a couple of minutes to look over some of those others, like the practical implication of how can understanding impermanence help us to live more fully in the present moment? And how can it help us to let go of attachments and cultivate a sense of equanimity? See if any of these questions instill some comments from you about some of your experience. Does understanding impermanence lead to a sense of despair or a sense of liberation? Can it help us appreciate the preciousness of life? What does the Buddha really mean by suffering or unsatisfactoriness in the context of these three marks of existence, of these three truths? Is it just about physical or emotional distress, or does it encompass a deeper sense of dissatisfaction with the nature of existence? And I pointed out a brief uh, acknowledgement of how dukkha relates to the Four Noble Truths and what are the root causes of suffering and how can we address them? And then there's not self. What does it mean to say that there's no permanent, unchanging self? And how does this understanding challenge our conventional notions of identity and individuality? This is always a current topic of discussion because we have many identities that want to be known and speak up to be heard and seen. And it's important that we are able to express our individuality. And at the same time, we have this idea that we're seeking to understand directly of, you know, not self. And how does the concept of anatta relate to interconnectedness of all things? How can we cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion for others, knowing that we're all a part of the larger whole? How can we use understanding of anatta to live more fully in the present moment? And how can we let go of our attachments to the past and our anxieties about the future? So I'll give you a little time to think about it, see if any of those questions or what comes up from your personal experience. And Margaret, I see your hand, so I'll call on you in a minute. And, you know, some of it seems complicated. Don't worry about it. Some of it's useful and you can reflect on it later. But anicca, anatta, and dukkha, very, very important as the universal truths.